Hi there. I'm just a little cat trying to reach my first 1,000 subscribers. It's free. Just click subscribe right under this video. It would mean the world to me.
They say there are moments that don't just hurt. They define you, moments that carve a permanent line between who you used to be and who you're about to become. And for me, that moment came on a humid afternoon in late August, when I stepped into our garage and found my brother Tyler beaming next to a brand new, fire engine red pickup truck that still had the dealership tag hanging off the rearview mirror. He was posing like he'd just won the lottery, slapping the hood like it was some kind of prize beast at a county fair, while my dad clapped him on the back and my mom stood nearby with her phone, recording the whole thing like a proud pageant mom capturing her golden boy's crowning achievement. And I just stood there, holding the acceptance letter from State University in my hand, the one I had brought downstairs to show them, the one I had opened only minutes ago upstairs in my bedroom with trembling fingers and a fluttering hope that, just this once, something might go right for me. I didn't say anything, not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't. It was like my voice got caught somewhere between my chest and my throat, strangled by the sheer absurdity of the moment. 2 weeks earlier, when I had shown my parents the tuition sheet and asked, meekly, almost embarrassed, if there was any way they could help cover even part of the cost, maybe just enough to keep me from taking out another loan on top of the one I'd already signed, they had sighed in perfect unison and said those 8 words that still rattle around in the back of my skull like a loose screw every time I think about them. We just don't have the money for college. They said it kindly, almost apologetically, with those tired eyes and soft voices that make you feel guilty for even asking. They told me they wished they could help, that times were tight, that Tyler needed braces and the house needed repairs, and they just couldn't stretch things any further. I didn't argue. I nodded like the good daughter I'd been trained to be, and told them I understood, even though something in me didn't. Not really, but I made peace with it. Or at least I tried to. I figured I'd just work more hours at the diner, take a couple of online courses at the community college to keep things moving, and apply again next year with some scholarship essays that might actually get read. I wasn't angry at them. Not yet. I was just tired. And then, 2 weeks later, there was the truck. $40,000, according to the receipt I later found stuffed in the junk drawer next to the expired coupons and broken tape dispenser. Not leased. Bought outright. My dad's handwriting at the bottom of the check. To support his future, my mom had said, when I finally found the words to ask, very carefully, how exactly that made sense. He wants to start a small landscaping business with his friend Brandon, she explained, like it was the most logical thing in the world. He needs reliable transportation for the equipment, and you know how hard it is to find good used trucks these days. It's an investment in his future. I didn't laugh. I didn't cry either. I just nodded, walked back upstairs, and sat down on my bed. The college acceptance letter still sitting on my desk, its proud little header taunting me like a joke only I could hear. That night, I lay awake long after the house went quiet, listening to the muffled sound of Tyler blasting country music in the driveway, revving the engine over and over like a teenage boy who believed volume equaled power. And I thought, not bitterly, not even sadly, just with a sort of strange clarity I hadn't felt before, that I wasn't going to fight for a seat at a table where I had clearly never been wanted. Because the truth was, this wasn't about money, not really. This was about belief. It was about where they chose to place their faith. And they had made that choice loud and clear. Tyler was worth the risk. Tyler was worth the check. Tyler was worth the applause and the attention and the excited videos posted to Facebook with captions like, "So proud of our boy." I was not. And so I made a decision, not out of spite and not as some grand act of rebellion, but as a quiet, calculated choice born from years of being the afterthought, the reliable one, the helper, the background character in my own life. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to explain myself. I wasn't even going to tell them what I had planned. I was going to vanish, right in front of them, and build something they'd never be able to take credit for. So I packed away my letter. I logged into every scholarship portal I could find. I researched every community grant, every need-based award, every late deadline still open. I signed up for night shifts, sold the few things I had of value, including my grandmother's necklace, which I knew my mother would pretend to care about if she noticed it was missing, but she never did. And in the meantime, I watched as Tyler drove that truck around town like a badge of honor, picking up mulch he never delivered, quoting jobs he never finished, blaming everyone but himself when clients stopped calling. He was their chosen one, their hopeful little gamble, and I was just the shadow they forgot to factor into the equation. But the thing about shadows is, they don't go away, they just wait. And while my brother's future was burning fuel by the mile, mine was sharpening itself like a blade. Because I already knew exactly where I'd be 4 years from that day, and I knew what I would do when the time came. But for now, I just smiled when my mom asked if I could take a picture of Tyler with the truck for her Facebook post. I said sure. Then I snapped the photo, handed the phone back, and walked away, quiet, invisible, and absolutely sure of one thing. They were going to regret underestimating me. And when they did, I'd make sure they remembered every detail. The first time I realized just how invisible I had become in my own family was not the day they bought my brother a $40,000 truck after telling me they couldn't afford a single cent toward my tuition. That was the moment the delusion cracked. But rather, it was a few weeks later, standing in the narrow back hallway of the coffee shop, where I'd just finished an 8-hour shift, slinging burnt espresso and wiping down sticky tables, when my mother called to ask if I could come home that weekend and help clean out the garage for Tyler's new business setup. She said it casually, as though the last conversation between us hadn't ended with me blinking back tears while she enthusiastically filmed Tyler revving the engine of his brand new toy, as if she hadn't somehow forgotten to ask whether I'd made other plans for my future, as if I didn't exist beyond the utility I could provide for other people's dreams. I held the phone to my ear with one hand and pushed open the fire door with the other, stepping into the biting dusk air that always smelled like burned toast and tired ambition. And I told her, very softly, that I was busy, said I was picking up extra shifts to save for textbooks, lied and told her I'd applied to a few online classes and was thinking of maybe doing a part-time semester if I could juggle the hours. She sighed, said something like, "Well, don't burn yourself out, sweetie." And I could tell, just from the flatness of her tone, that she wasn't listening, not really. She'd already mentally filed me into the bin of forgettable, low-maintenance daughters who don't cause trouble and don't need much attention. I ended the call with a polite, "Love you," not because I meant it at that moment, but because that was the script I had been taught to follow, and I was too exhausted to deviate from it just yet. But the truth, the one I never told her and never intended to tell her, was that I had been accepted into a program at a state university 2 towns over, a small but competitive program in digital communications with an on-campus job opportunity that would not only cover my living expenses, but also allow me to slowly chip away at my tuition without having to rely on anyone's approval or assistance. One of my high school teachers, Mrs. Whitaker, bless that woman, had written me a glowing recommendation and personally walked my essay into the office of Professor Lillian Greeley, a woman who would go on to become the first real mentor I'd ever had. The first adult who saw me not as a backup singer to my brother's big debut, but as someone capable of writing her own story. That first semester, I lived in a roach-bitten sublet with peeling linoleum and a heater that made death-rattle noises in the middle of the night, ate off-brand cereal for dinner, and typed essays on a refurbished laptop that overheated if I used more than 3 tabs at once. I took early morning shifts at a diner where the manager once told me I smiled too quietly, spent evenings as a library assistant reshelving thick, dust-covered anthologies, and used my weekends helping clean houses in the nicer part of town, where teenagers in hoodies more expensive than my rent played lacrosse on perfectly mowed lawns, and their parents handed me envelopes labeled tip, without looking me in the eye. Every dollar I earned went into 3 categories: rent, tuition, and survival. There was no extra, there was no margin, and yet I felt more powerful, more alive, and more in control of my life than I ever had in my parents' house. Tyler, meanwhile, had managed to rack up a list of petty infractions longer than my transcript. failing to show up to landscaping jobs, forgetting to submit paperwork for permits, getting into a shouting match with a client who'd asked for mulch and received gravel instead. And while I didn't have access to every detail, I knew enough from the snippets my mother occasionally let slip during our short phone calls to understand that his so-called business was, at best, a hobby with an expensive starter kit and, at worst, a slow-moving train wreck disguised as entrepreneurial spirit. But no one dared call it what it was. My dad still bragged to the neighbors about Tyler's growing company, and my mom still posted filtered pictures of him on the job with captions like, "So proud of our hard-working boy," even though half of those pictures had been staged in our backyard using borrowed equipment. And through all of this, I said nothing. I didn't correct them. I didn't offer updates about my own life. When they asked, I gave vague, half-formed answers, told them things were fine, that work was steady, that school was still on hold. I let them believe I was stuck, drifting, unambitious, because the truth was, I needed the distance their dismissal gave me. If they thought I was floundering, they wouldn't ask questions. And if they didn't ask questions, I could build my life without interference, without guilt, without the constant weight of being told I was too serious, or too intense, or too much. There was a kind of liberation in their forgetfulness, in the way they slowly stopped inviting me to family dinners or holiday gatherings, claiming I was probably too busy anyway or so focused on work it wouldn't be fun for you. I let them forget. I encouraged it. Because what they were really saying was, "We don't want you here if you're not going to play the part we assigned you," and I had finally decided I wasn't going to audition anymore. By the time my second year rolled around, I had moved into a student apartment provided by the university, earned a partial scholarship from an essay competition about self-reliance that I submitted under a pen name, and had been offered a position assisting Professor Greeley with her research on media ethics, a job that not only paid more than my library shift, but also gave me a quiet kind of joy I hadn't realized I'd been missing. I was, for the first time, thriving, and no one in my family had the faintest idea. When my mom called one evening, her voice thick with frustration, to vent about how Tyler had dented the truck trying to reverse into a driveway he never should have been parked in to begin with, I listened, made sympathetic noises, and asked if she wanted me to Venmo her $20 for gas. She declined, of course. That wasn't the point. The point was to talk about Tyler, to paint herself as the weary mother holding everything together, to remind me, subtly, always subtly, that some sacrifices just had to be made for the child who needed more. I ended the call as she launched into another story about how hard it was to find good workers these days, and how lucky Tyler was to be creating something of his own. And as I clicked off the phone, I stared at the email on my screen. From Dean Andrews confirming my participation in the commencement speaker selection process. An email I hadn't told anyone about, not even my friends. And I smiled. I wasn't just disappearing. I was building an exit strategy so elegant and so silent they wouldn't even know I'd left. Until it was too late to follow. There's something strangely liberating, almost seductive, in a quiet, dangerous way, about realizing that the people who once claimed to love you unconditionally no longer bother to remember the details of your life, as if letting those details slip through the cracks of their attention was just another small, harmless act, like forgetting to take the trash out or leaving the TV on overnight. When in truth, that kind of forgetting isn't harmless at all. It's a slow, invisible erasure that chips away at your presence until even your shadow stops registering in the room. And that's exactly what I let happen, not because I wanted to disappear in some dramatic blaze of defiance, but because I finally understood that being forgotten on purpose gave me something I'd never had growing up in that house: freedom from the suffocating need to be seen, recognized, or validated by people who only valued visibility when it served their image. By my third year, I had learned to speak only when necessary, to answer texts with a polite but emotionally empty tone, and to wrap every conversation with a little bow of indifference, so that no one on the other end could suspect just how carefully I was choosing my silence. When my father texted to ask if I was still doing that school thing, I responded with a quick, yeah, taking some online classes here and there, even though by that point I was already deep into a research project that had been nominated for a regional grant, and my name had been mentioned twice at faculty meetings, once even by the university president, who, according to Professor Greeley, had circled my essay portfolio and written the word impressive in red pen on the margin. But of course, none of that was something I shared, because sharing would invite curiosity, and curiosity would eventually lead to opinions, advice, and the slow crawl of control that had always defined my relationship with my family. So instead, I let them assume I was floating, drifting, maybe even floundering a bit. The lost daughter, the unremarkable one, the girl who never quite figured things out but didn't cause enough trouble to be considered a problem. Meanwhile, Tyler, the golden child with his cracked sunglasses and permanently backward baseball cap, had taken a sudden interest in cryptocurrency and online trading after his landscaping business quietly imploded, and my parents, eager to cling to any new narrative that might validate their previous investments, had bought him a 3-month crash course subscription and started referring to his daily screen staring as independent finance work, as if refreshing a Reddit thread every 5 minutes was equivalent to running a hedge fund. When his truck finally broke down after a botched attempt to install a lift kit with a guy named Bryce, who kinda knew his way around engines, my father spent 3 weekends in the garage trying to fix it, while my mother posted throwback pictures of Tyler in his high school football jersey, captioned with cryptic phrases like, "You were born to overcome." It was exhausting to watch from a distance, even more so when they occasionally called to ask for help. Not with money, of course, because they still assumed I was barely scraping by, but with things like proofing Tyler's resume or helping him format a business email, as if my time were still theirs to use whenever they remembered I existed. But I didn't argue. I didn't roll my eyes or snap back or say the things I wanted to say. The sentences that lined themselves up in my head like soldiers waiting for battle. Instead, I offered to help, then gently delayed the task until they either forgot about it or decided to do it themselves. I let them think I was unreliable. I let them write me off. And in that space, wide, quiet, and beautifully empty, I built something no one could take from me. I moved into a 1-bedroom graduate dorm that fall. A small, sunlit apartment with peeling paint and a drafty window, but a view of the campus gardens that made the cold feel just a little less bitter. I painted the walls a soft shade of gray-blue, strung up cheap fairy lights above the desk, where I wrote for hours each night, and kept a tiny kettle humming on the stove, always ready to boil water for tea or instant noodles, or the kind of late-night comfort that doesn't taste like much, but feels like safety. I filled notebooks with ideas, plans, and pieces of a speech I hadn't officially been asked to give yet, but somehow knew I would. Lines that started as whispers in my head and slowly grew louder each time I watched a classmate drop out or a professor raise their eyebrow and say, "You really think this topic is worth defending?" And I always did, because for the first time in my life, I believed in my own worth without waiting for someone else to confirm it. And then, one afternoon in late spring, just as the semester was winding down, and the campus had that strange suspended-in-time feeling that always comes before graduation, I got an email from Dean Andrews, short and simple, with the subject line, "You're on the list." I read it 3 times before letting myself breathe. The commencement committee had chosen me to give the student speech at graduation, and while they hadn't finalized the order or announced it publicly, I was, as the dean put it, the first name we circled unanimously. I stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling the weight of everything I'd carried suddenly shift, not disappear, but reposition itself in a way that felt like progress, like closure in motion. I didn't tell anyone, not my classmates, not even Professor Greeley. I just clicked reply, typed a quiet, "Thank you for believing in me," and hit send. In the weeks that followed, I crafted the speech late at night, rewriting paragraphs by candlelight, sometimes laughing to myself at the irony of it all. How I, the girl whose parents couldn't spare a dime for college, would be the one standing on that stage, speaking not just for myself, but for every student who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or quietly pushed aside in favor of someone louder, shinier, or more obviously promising. I didn't write it out of bitterness. I wrote it from the hollow that had formed and hardened inside me over years of being treated like a backup plan, and from the strength I'd grown by never letting that hollow turn into something brittle or mean. When my mother called the week before graduation, I answered on the second ring, not out of excitement or habit, but because I knew somehow that this call would be different. She sounded distracted, stressed, her voice tight with that tone she always used when trying to sound calm while barely holding it together. She asked if I would be attending my friend's graduation after all, and I realized she didn't even remember which university I was supposed to be enrolled in. I told her I hadn't decided yet. She said it might be nice to see me, that it had been too long, and then quickly mentioned that Tyler might not make it because he was working on a new project, which I translated as sitting in his room watching YouTube videos about passive income. I told her I'd let her know. I hung up and stared at my screen for a long time, the cursor blinking on the last line of my speech, waiting for the final sentence, the one that would tie it all together, the one that would make them feel it, really feel it, without ever mentioning names. And then, as if it had always been there, buried just beneath the surface, it came to me. Sometimes the loudest revenge isn't noise. It's the sound of your name being called in a room full of people who never thought to look for you there. The morning of graduation began. Not with triumph, not with the cinematic swell of violins or the sun piercing a perfect sky, but rather with a thick, gray overcast that settled low over the university, like a wool blanket, making everything feel heavy, slow, and curiously intimate, like the entire campus had agreed, in some quiet, unspoken way, to lean into the weight of the day. The air buzzed with a strange, almost sacred nervousness, the kind that comes not from fear, but from the knowledge that something permanent is about to shift, that by sunset, nothing will be quite the same, no matter how tightly you hold on to the illusion of routine. I stood in front of the mirror in the cramped backstage area of the auditorium, my hands adjusting the black cap that had refused to sit straight on my head all morning, and I stared not at my reflection, but at the worn edges of the neckline on my gown. Noticing how even the ceremonial clothing bore the fingerprints of 1,000 students who had come before me, each one trying to leave something behind, hope, maybe, or anger, or some fragile scrap of themselves that hadn't been recognized until that final walk across the stage. My name was printed second to last on the program, tucked quietly into the slot designated for the student speaker, and while no one in my family knew it yet, I had spent weeks rehearsing the exact moment I would step into the light. The precise cadence of the words I would deliver, not for applause or recognition, but for the quiet, hungry part of me that had been ignored for far too long. I had asked Dean Andrews, kind, sharp-eyed Dean Andrews, who always knew more than he let on, for one favor when the program was being finalized. I asked not to be announced ahead of time, no social media post, no newsletter highlight, no family notifications, just a clean entrance, a name called like any other, a face in the crowd until it mattered most. He had nodded once, without question, and made it happen, because he understood. He always had. Meanwhile, across campus, in the administrative wing nestled just behind the main lawn, my mother was pacing a worn patch into the carpet of the dean's office, her voice raised not with rage, but with the urgent, trembling panic of someone who had just realized, far too late, that they were no longer the central figure in someone else's story. According to the assistant who had overheard the exchange, and later told me with the guilty delight of someone sharing a secret they knew they shouldn't, I was officially missing, a word my mother had used more than once, her hands fluttering like broken wings as she insisted that she couldn't find me, hadn't heard from me all week, and needed to know where I was sitting so she could get pictures for the family. The irony, of course, was staggering. For years, I had been invisible in every way that mattered, absent from conversations, overlooked at dinners, treated as a polite background presence in Tyler's constant stream of noise, And now, when I had orchestrated my invisibility to perfection, suddenly my absence was a crisis. Not because I was loved, not because I was missed, but because my lack of presence would be noticed by others, and that, more than any actual concern for me, was what cracked her composure wide open. Dean Andrews, in his calm, unhurried way, had listened patiently to her monologue, nodding occasionally, tapping his pen once or twice against the edge of his desk, as though measuring her words for weight and consequence. And then, when she finally paused to breathe, he offered her a small, almost imperceptible smile and said, "Your daughter asked for privacy today. I intend to honor that." It wasn't cruel, it wasn't even cold, but it landed like a slap nonetheless, because in that moment, my mother finally understood that something had shifted out of her reach, and not just for today, but permanently. The daughter she had treated as an afterthought, the quiet shadow who never asked for anything, had found a door she didn't even know existed, and walked through it without ever looking back. Backstage, I could hear the final names being called, the polite smattering of applause that followed each one, the low murmur of family chatter rising and falling like ocean waves behind the main curtain. I took a breath, steadying myself not with pride, but with a deep, simmering calm that felt almost holy, the kind of peace that only comes when you've spent years carrying the weight of someone else's expectations and have finally, decisively, chosen to set them down. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't excited. I was ready. And then the announcer spoke my name, just once, clean and unembellished, and I stepped onto the stage. The lights didn't blind me the way I expected. Instead, they illuminated the rows of faces stretched out across the auditorium, a sea of expressions ranging from boredom to delight to quiet confusion as people began flipping through their programs, trying to place me, to remember if they'd seen me around, to figure out why the last speaker wasn't the same face they'd seen on the preview flyers last month. And then I saw her, my mother, standing at the edge of the third row, her hands clutching her phone like a lifeline, her mouth slightly open in that unmistakable shape of someone caught completely off guard. She had found me, yes, but not in the way she wanted. I didn't look away. Instead, I adjusted the mic, cleared my throat, and began. Not with a joke, not with a thank you, but with a story. My story. I spoke about quiet students, the ones no one remembers in yearbooks, the ones who sit at the edge of family photos, who get labeled as low maintenance and are therefore handed nothing. I talked about invisible effort, about earning degrees while pretending to be a failure for the comfort of others, about the power of disappearing not to vanish, but to grow beyond the reach of those who never thought to water you. I didn't mention names. I didn't need to. But I saw, in the way certain heads turned and a few parents glanced sideways at their own children, that they understood exactly what I meant. My mother sat perfectly still, her phone forgotten in her lap, her face a mask of something between confusion and dawning guilt. And when I finished, when I thanked the people who had seen me, truly seen me, and left out any reference to my family entirely, there was a pause, a long electric pause that felt heavier than silence, and then the room erupted into applause. I nodded once, stepped down from the stage, and walked directly past her. She didn't speak. Neither did I. Because some reunions don't happen in words. Some reckonings are quiet. And sometimes the only sound you need is your own footsteps walking away, while the people who never believed in you are left sitting in their silence, wondering how they missed so much for so long. There are moments in life when clarity does not come gently or with poetic grace, but rather arrives like a sudden, uninvited guest that crashes into your awareness with all the subtlety of broken glass on marble, loud, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. And that was precisely how I felt as I stood in the quiet hallway outside the dean's office after the ceremony, my graduation gown clinging to the backs of my legs in the humidity, the echo of the applause still ringing faintly in my ears, like a ghost of something already fading. The celebration had begun to disperse into polite conversations and photo-taking chaos. Mortarboards had been tossed and retrieved. Families had begun comparing dinner reservations, and the air was thick with the kind of hollow joy that often follows events where people clap more out of ritual than meaning. But I wasn't waiting for pictures or hugs or congratulations. I was waiting for silence, for the moment when the theater of the day was over and I could slip out the side door before anyone remembered to ask me where I'd been all these years. And then, almost on cue, the door to the office creaked open, and there she was, my mother, her eyes still red at the edges from the crying she likely couldn't explain. Her shoulders wrapped in a cardigan that hung awkwardly, like it belonged to someone else entirely. And for the first time in my life, she looked small. Not physically, of course. She was still the same woman who could cut a conversation short with a single well-placed sigh. Still the same mother who had once told me, with a smile too tight to be genuine, that it was better to stay humble than to chase attention. But there, in the filtered hallway light, clutching a program with my name printed under the words commencement speaker, she looked lost, not in the way she had described me earlier to the dean, but in the way people look when the narrative they've built around themselves begins to crack under the weight of truth they didn't see coming. She opened her mouth, perhaps to say something kind or defensive or even performative. Who knows? But I raised my hand gently, firmly, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. I didn't want a scene. I didn't want apologies wrapped in excuses or compliments that would sound like pity masquerading as pride. I simply wanted her to understand what I had come to understand after all these years. I was never the one who had disappeared from this family. I had just stopped auditioning for a role that was never mine to begin with. There's a difference between being lost and being left out, and I had spent far too long letting other people confuse the two. I gave her a nod, nothing more, nothing less, and turned away before her lips could form whatever sentence she was desperately trying to force into the moment. I didn't look back. Instead, I made my way toward the sculpture garden behind the auditorium, the one few people ever visited because it was tucked just far enough from the main quad to be inconvenient, and I sat on the edge of the fountain with my shoes in my hands, the gravel biting gently at the soles of my feet, as I let myself finally exhale, not from exhaustion, but from release. For the first time in years, maybe ever, I wasn't holding anything back. Not resentment, not grief, not hope. Everything I had needed to say had been said, not just through the speech, but through the years of quiet choices that led to this exact moment. And though there would never be a perfect resolution, no Hollywood reconciliation with music swelling in the background and a tearful embrace that made it all okay, there was something even better. The knowledge that I had become someone who no longer needed their permission to exist fully. Later that evening, after the crowds had thinned and the sun had begun to dip below the library roof in a soft golden gradient, I returned to the dean's office with a manila envelope tucked under my arm, the same one I had written weeks ago, sealed with the letter I had drafted and redrafted more times than I could count, not out of hope for a response, but out of the need to speak my truth without interruption. I asked the receptionist to place it on the desk, addressed simply to Karen Chase, and I left without waiting to hear whether she'd actually come back to pick it up. Inside the envelope, I hadn't written anything dramatic or poetic. There were no accusations, no attempts to shame or punish. Just a single-page letter written in calm, measured words that outlined the scholarships I had earned, the jobs I had held, the papers I had published, the grants I had secured, and the names of every person who had helped me along the way. At the bottom, I had added one final line. You told me we couldn't afford my future, so I built one without you. I don't know if she ever opened it. Maybe she tore it up. Maybe she kept it in a drawer, unopened, the weight of the unknown gnawing at her every time she passed it by. Or maybe she read it and sat there in silence, realizing that the daughter she had dismissed as emotionally self-sufficient had simply learned how to thrive in the absence of love that didn't come with conditions. Whatever she did with it wasn't mine to control anymore. That part of the story belonged to her. As for me, I packed up my apartment that summer without ceremony. I turned in my keys, mailed thank you notes to my professors, donated half my clothes to the campus shelter, and boarded a train heading north with nothing but a suitcase, a laptop, and the kind of peace that comes not from being acknowledged, but from no longer needing to be. And though the journey ahead was uncertain, what mattered was that it would be mine, crafted not from obligation or guilt, but from the quiet, unshakable knowledge that I had already faced the worst kind of invisibility and come out the other side not broken, but whole. Because in the end, I was never truly lost. I was ignored, and now they would never forget it.